Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here alone today. Bob Schlehuber is on the beach somewhere, but he will be back here tomorrow. That, however, will not stop us from going against the grain. We have a loaded show for you today. This weekend was captured by protests that swept not just through United States cities, but cities all across the world in direct repudiation of the heinous killing by Derek Chauvin of one George Floyd. London, New Zealand, Germany, and like I said, 140 cities all across the United States. Multicultural, multiracial. This, in real terms, is what solidarity looks like. We'll be discussing news from around the world regarding the protests, including spots of riots and fires, in addition to the repressive measures states are using to quell the uprisings, including what seems to be systematic targeting of the press for arrests and attack. We'll also expose one Joe Biden for trying to exploit the recent tragedy for political ends, despite Joe Biden arguably, more than anyone else alive, being uniquely responsible for the economic and, for that matter, the criminal justice system to which we are fighting against right now. A bit later in the hour, we'll bring you news from the ground reporting from the Minnesota protests, what people are saying, what their grievances are, and more importantly, what are the demands. In the second hour, we'll discuss the media's portrayal of the protests, namely the persistent narrative that started rather early on that the protests were being invaded by foreigners from out of state. Mind you, there were protests in 140 cities across the United States. That is a lot of foreigners. If that wasn't odd enough, the usual suspects landed on national television to tell people that the reason that people are angry, the reason that people are freaking out, the reason that people are burning stuff down is because of Russia and China. No, seriously. The fact that you have 100,000 people dead, 40 million people out of a job, and the cops still not relenting and killing people, that in and of itself is not enough for people to protest. No, it had to be the Russians and the Chinese. That's astonishing. Last but not least, it is Monday. That means our Miss the Press segment. This is the segment we get to lampoon Sunday morning talking heads, the things that they say versus the things that they hide. But let's start here. I watched the protests over the weekend, and I was glued to social media, and I was looking at the various states, CNN getting their place, basically, the sign wasted, watching the police station being burned, in fact, having somewhat of a deep satisfaction with the police station, or for that matter, police cars being burned, seeing stores looted, that one bothered me somewhat, the rioting, seeing innocent people getting injured. I watch people wring their hands over this stuff and say, oh, this type of violence doesn't necessarily work. People shouldn't do this or people shouldn't do that. While you had other people who were euphoric, who lefties who were like, yes, this is the uprising. This is the revolution. This is what we waited on. And you had others who took a weird positioning that it was the Russians and the Chinese that were propagating racial divides within the country, missing the fact that a man had literally just been murdered to death casually by a cop. And that was on top of killings where cops were shooting through windows or barging in doors, meaning even being in your house didn't necessarily mean that you were necessarily safe from a cop coming to get you. But the Chinese and the Russians, that was the issue. To me, I look at the stuff that inequality creates an energy of its own. It's almost like inequality creates a potential energy that strives, that yearns to basically be made kinetic. You've had 40, 50 years of a political system that basically didn't pay attention to the population, where they would say you have nowhere else to go, and they would expect lefties, and they would expect blacks, or for the matter, Hispanics, to basically fall in line. Now, this was in spite, not dealing with economic concerns. And so you ended up with people vacillating between two parties, trying to find anything to get them out of a quagmire that they found themselves in. Meaning when those people were looking for something like hope and change, and Obama came along with that hope and change message, it was like, yes, we got our hope and change. Oh, we didn't get our hope and change. Then they immediately go to Trump. Yeah, oh, not a hope and change again. He gave trillions of dollars and he's incompetent. The people were looking for something else. They were craving something. Why do you think they were willing to go to Donald Trump as opposed to picking Hillary Clinton? Yes, by having incrementalists in office, not dealing with the real material concerns of the population, you do create a situation where people bleed out of the political process, giving it much more likely for another particular party to take over. But I'm getting more to something more basic. The people wanted something fundamentally different because the political space and our economic space was not dealing with their main concerns. And right now, the exceptional nation, the indispensable nation, has all of these traumas, and all of these are self-imposed. Think about it for the moment. We had a coronavirus. Now, before the coronavirus even hit, the majority of the population was living paycheck to paycheck. Before the coronavirus even hit, the majority of the population didn't have $500 in the bank. Before this hit, you had millions without health care. Think of how weird that is. In the United States, despite the fact that we pay 2-3 times more than anywhere else in the nation, anywhere else in the world for health care, less health care. It's utterly astonishing. We pay more for less. The amount that we pay for drugs, the amount that we pay for education, all of these things are expensive. And despite all of these things being expensive, you have half of the population barely making ends meet, if they're making ends meet at all. Now, you let that ride for 40 years. You have an economic crash in 2008 where you don't deal with the material concerns. You let Wall Street walk while at the same time you let homeowners go bust. What is your population to think in that scenario? You get a political leader that comes in screaming hope and change, and those people think that that guy's going to do something, and that guy basically is the same guy that was in there before, this time just with a D beside his name. What does your population do? Obama gave 95% of the income to the top 1% during the time where income inequality was at the greatest extent that it had ever been. That was the Democrat. That was the guy who they said was a progressive. That was the guy who was supposed to be a lefty. Where's the public to go? If from the standpoint of the political space, the left-wing party basically gives 95% of the income to the top 1%, where does the public go in a situation like that? For the longest time, I kept asking myself, at what point does the public have enough? What point does the public say, I'm done, that I'm sick of this? When does the momentum turn to where it takes more energy just to stand still than it actually does to get something different and to actually make that change? And sometimes those things come in weird and strange places. The catch here is, in America, you would think that the 95% to the top 1% should have been enough, considering we had a financial crash, considering the government protected Wall Street while letting homeowners go bust. You would think that in and of itself would have been enough, even the talking about cutting Social Security during that same time. But it wasn't enough. So fine. So then you have a coronavirus, a pandemic, where you lose 40 million jobs. And again, you lose those 40 million jobs out of incompetence. The government made a specific choice to cater to the owner class in the middle of a pandemic. So instead of making sure that people had their wages, to ensure that people were safe and secure in their homes with the revenue that they had at their disposal, with the rents that weren't being canceled so they won't be evicted out of their house, that they would have food without necessarily having to go to a food bank. Instead of ensuring that people, over the course of the time frame of this particular pandemic, something that is real, by the way, dealing with people's material needs, they gave trillions of dollars to corporations while giving $1,200 to the rest of the population, basically a pittance. Why? Because what the government wanted was for those people to go back to work. And if you gave those people and made those people whole for 2-3 months, those people don't need to go back to work. That energy isn't in them. That prick isn't in them where you're using their own vulnerability and their own needs to basically force them into a situation that wasn't healthy. That's what our government was doing. Think of how maniac that is. We're willing for people to die if that means we're going to get those people back on their jobs. You didn't have to do that. They chose to do that. That was a choice. It was a choice to give people $1,200 while giving these other guys trillions of dollars. Those things were choices. It was choices not to put restraints on that. It was a choice for the Democratic Party to go along with each and every one of those bills, despite the fact that those bills didn't attend to the material needs of the population that they were supposed to be out there philosophically representing. Those things were choices. All of those things were political choices. They weren't acts of God. Your society didn't have to turn out this way from the standpoint of the pandemic. 40 million people are without a job. Put that in perspective. Think of the number of evictions that are going to take place. Think of the number of people who are in food banks right now because they don't have ends. Think of the people who the $1,200 didn't even pay the rent, or the unemployment benefits didn't even come. Because just because you say, yes, we're going to put out unemployment benefits doesn't necessarily mean that people are able to get those benefits. Choices. Political choices. Now, on top of a pandemic, you have the situation with the 40 million people that are out of a job. Now, on top of the 40 million people that are out of a job, the cops, for whatever reason, still kept rolling around, shooting people in the face. And in doing so, created an uprising. Now, the catch here is, over the course of the last, 8 years, you had a Sanders running with this notion of class. And in running with this notion of class for the last 8 years, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, the public has started to think about their political space in a way that wasn't there prior. Meaning, for the longest time, economics was taken off the table in regards to the topic of debate. Not anymore. And the moment that you've added economics to the table as a topic of debate, and you've set off this, meaning the protests have been multicultural, multiracial. Have you considered why? Think about it. Why is this protest different than some of the other protests? Why is this erupted that fast? Why is it swept across the nation to such an extent, with such a ferocity and such a speed? Does it have anything to do potentially with the fact that by having this argument about class and being in the middle of a pandemic, people are acutely aware that despite this started off with something as a racial flare-up, so many people could watch that video and were completely aggrieved by what took place. And in their various states where they've had police abuse and police violence, it automatically hits something deep. But on top of that, other cultures, other races, this argument of, are you willing to fight for somebody who is not like you? Those things kind of come back into play with a large number of people who are outside of just African Americans getting involved, arguing for things like rents, arguing for things like income inequality. I heard one protest where the people were screaming, "Eat the rich." This is what solidarity looks like. What did you think was going to happen if you have decades of a situation where the wealth gets accrued further and further to the top while making everyone's life that much more miserable? And would it come out something like this? Just because protests start a particular way, it doesn't necessarily mean they continue to perpetuate that way. Think about the Russian Revolution and how that started. The two Russian revolutions, actually, in regards to kicking off from the standpoint of a revolution. Think about what has taken place in France with the Yellow Vest movement, how that started off of this issue of a gas hike and then became larger, broader complaints and concerns about the things that the public wanted. That is how revolutions start. It is not going to always be peaceful. It is not going to always be within the boundaries and the reins. It is somewhat unreasonable to even think such a thing is going to take place. You have 140 different cities with all of these people in various cities with all of these different grievances and all of these things that they're angry about, upset about, that they want to get their you could say their legitimate rage out in response to. Some of those people will be peaceful. Others will not be. I'm making the very basic point, though, that it's somewhat unreasonable to believe that everybody will be. Why would you expect such? Think about what our society goes through. Think about the violence that takes place from the standpoint of just people as they try to live through their day from the standpoint of poverty, not having food, not being able to pay for their kids to do X or Y, not being able to get their meds or medication. Those things bite. And those things are, in and of themselves, a form of violence. All of this should have been expected. All of it. Because there's only so much time that people are going to be willing to take that much trash or that much disengagement from a political sense or process that deals with their material needs before they respond. What we're seeing is a response. My question is, how long is that response going to go, and what is it going to take to quell it? And with that, we're going to take our first break of the hour. In a moment, we'll be joined by Fault Line's own Garland Nixon to discuss Biden's role in creating the economic and criminal justice conditions being protested right now. We'll also get into Trump calling Antifa a terrorist organization. And if that's not enough, we have the second hour after that. You are listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in DC. We'll be back after this.
Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Bio. This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PE, America Top.
I'm here, ready to go.
My name is Jim.
Perfect. Thank you, darling. Tom Luongo, don't cook. We just have about 60 seconds. I'm pretty sure you know this commercial.
Dear Roger, for news benefit.
Until 60 seconds or right
So Fox.
Hey, this is Raheem from DC.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning, I'm looking for what's on the queue for a day. I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is a great show on the radio. I enjoy it immensely. Talking with Lee and Garland, they always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan. Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself. Right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. My co-host, Bob Schlager, will be back from a short vacation tomorrow. But again, that doesn't stop us from doing what we do here. If you guys dig what we're putting down, definitely give us a like and a share. Also, your chats, tweets, and calls, I amply appreciate it. You can give us a call at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Be sure to keep it PG. So protests have erupted all over the world over the murder of George Floyd by former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Chauvin was arrested and charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Now, the three other officers that stood there watching their co-worker murder a man in slow motion have not yet been charged. However, Keith Ellison apparently is seriously looking at charging them. Despite the arrests, the protests over the weekend went unabated, expanding in intensity and severity, with the National Guard being called in 21 states to assist an already militarized police force in containing the uprising. While there were spots of violence and otherwise peaceful protests, everyone was targeted, including innocent bystanders. The press seems to be a particular irritation to the cops who frequently arrested them, or for that matter, attacked them with rubber bullets and tear gas. We also have the President of the United States seemingly out of touch, throwing fire on the gasoline of civil unrest with threats of murdering protesters. Trump also claimed that he would classify Antifa as a terrorist organization. Now, the Nazis in Charlottesville were quote-unquote good people, but the anti-fascists are the terrorists. Now, since Antifa is not really an organization, it is unclear on what Donald Trump is talking about. Now, to discuss the events that took place over the weekend, we're joined by our friend of the show, co-host of Fault Lines here on Radio Sputnik, Garland Nixon. Garland, how's it going today, man?
Great. How you doing, Jamal? Great to be here.
Absolutely. Good to join. Well, it's always nice to have you on the show, of course. So there were several angles to this, to put it mildly. There are a ton of angles that we can look at this. But at this point, it's clear. I mean, we've seen the video of the Floyd murder. I don't necessarily want to show that video. That video is difficult to watch. I'd like the political structures, or discuss the political structures that created our system, though, before we get into the other aspects of this. Because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris has been out in front and have been trying to take this cadence like, we got to do something different and we got to fight the system and everything else. Joe Biden was intimately responsible for creating the criminal justice system that we have right now and the economic situations that incentivize the difficulties that we have and that we're fighting against within the context of these protests. Let's hear Joe Biden talk about criminal justice going back when he was to the right of Ronald Reagan. Let's hear the clip.
In a nutshell, the president's plan doesn't include enough police officers to catch the violent thugs, not enough prosecutors to convict them, not enough judges to sentence them, and not enough prison cells to put them away for a long time. That's why right now, 6 out of every 10 criminals who are arrested on drug charges have their cases dropped. That's why we think the president should triple the commitment that he's made tonight for police, prosecutors, and judges for our cities and our states.
He should triple it, Garland. Triple. And the thugs, he sounds a lot like Donald Trump right there. I think people who are younger might not know that Joe Biden, but that is the Joe Biden that has been there for the majority of his career, right?
Yeah, and here's the thing about it. I mean, if I just take myself, because I run into this when I talk about this issue, I say, look, I was in law enforcement for over 20 years. I retired as a major, commander of the investigations division, commander of the training division, on and on and on. And I say I have some credibility when talking about the issue of law enforcement, et cetera, because I have a background. And then people say, oh, well, so you're a cop. And I go, but I'm on the board of directors for the ACLU, and I've been recognized nationally for my work on, police misconduct and criminal justice. Okay, why do I say all that to say this? Because if you want to listen to Garland Nixon talk to you about criminal justice reform or about police misconduct, you want to know what is my record. As Bill Parcells, the tuna, said, you are what your record says you are. So now for a Joe Biden or a Kamala Harris to wake up today and now they're on the cutting edge, they're on the vanguard of criminal justice reform. Well, they are what their record says they are. And they were, and not to defend Donald Trump, because in my opinion, he's an abhorrent racist as far as I'm concerned. However, when you look at this now, he inherited a racist system. He's a racist guy, so he's all for promulgating that system. However, these are the people that helped to build that racist system. And now for them to argue that the system that they built, the system that Kamala Harris worked in to incarcerate people, to keep people in jail, to utilize prison labor and refuse to let people out because they needed them for work, for her to come out and argue now that she's on the vanguard of, change for criminal justice reform, it rings hollow. And sadly, that's the Democratic Party in general, for people who worked to create a system that's unfair and unequal. When we look at what Bill Clinton did, when we look economically, and I think I agree with Chris Hedges, that's part of this is economical.
It is.
Economic.
There. And that's my point.
Right.
That's why I say it's on both sides. Because it's not to look at it and say, for example, when the issue first took place and Floyd was killed, and people initially, if you look back over, let's say 20 years or so, usually you would have African Americans, and it would be very specific. But that's not the way this broke down. This broke down among multiracial lines. And you ask this very question of, well, wait a minute, why are these people that upset? Why are they that angry? Well, it's two ends. It's the economic angle of people having a difficult situation because so much wealth has been expropriated to the top. Use just politics. I mean, just in the way the tax policy, the economic policies, all of those things basically serve to push wealth to the top. And then the Democratic Party and these guys then turn around and say, okay, and we're going to throw a bunch of cops in to deal with the chaos that results from that economic damage, as if the cops is the area that they're supposed to deal with this particular problem on. You can listen to the clips of Biden, where Biden goes in, I don't care what happened to their past, I don't care what their childhood was like, I don't care about any of that stuff, just lock them up.
Right. And see, here's what happens too, because I immediately when this happened, I thought to myself, okay, what if I was an alien? In the U.S., everything's about race. What if I was from another planet and I came and I looked at the demographics? I would say 30 and under, 35 and under, 40 and under. If you look at this and you're not an American who sees everything through the lens of race, you'll realize that what we have is the millennials and some of the Gen Xers are out there raising Cain. The pitchforks and the torches have come out. And these people have not, see, if I don't know, for people who listen to the show, they'll know, for the last 8 weeks, I've been saying there will be social unrest this summer. So I saw this coming. I didn't know what the spark would be. People have not had checks for 8 weeks. They can't dispatch their student loans. Now their jobs are gone, might not come back. They're looking at July that their unemployment insurance is going to run out. A tidal wave of evictions. You think this is bad? There will be a second wave of violence and social unrest when the sheriff's department are knocking on doors trying to evict. Literally, we got 42 million people out of work. What happens when they're trying to evict tens of millions of people? This is the beginning. This neoliberal nightmare of a country is falling apart at the seams. And if you look at the countries, they're not doing it in France or Russia. They're not doing this in England. They're unhappy, and there's a few people who want the lockdown in, but they ain't burning the place down. You know why? Because they paid the people 80% of their salary there, 75% of their salary. They told them to stay home. You can't come out, but they gave them the money they needed to at least survive. They didn't do that here. And all you needed was a spark and kaboom. And that was it. And let me add this. Okay, they're tearing stuff up. They're burning stuff up. But here's the way, and I may be wrong, here's the way I look at it. They look at the law enforcement, this metaphor of the system with its knee on your neck. And they're like, well, that's perfect because the system has its knee on my neck. And if you do not obey the law, if I look at the police and they're like, screw the law, we'll just kill anybody we want. Don't think that I used to teach this stuff. I used to teach organized crime. And one of the things that I taught during Prohibition, all crime went up. You know why? Because there was nothing but corruption everywhere. And this is the way people start to look at it historically. Hey, if the government and the cops ain't obeying the law, don't ask me to obey the law. It's a natural human reaction, Jamal.
Yes, it is. Like I said, injustice creates a potential energy of its own. And like you said, you didn't necessarily know what the spark was going to be, but it had to come from somewhere. Like I kept asking myself, like, what's the thing? What's the last straw that the American public accepts where they're like, I'm done? And because I was unclear on it. My thought was there's no way they would accept this in many of the other countries. But the catch is propaganda, right? Like if you have people in a certain mindset where they don't think, for example, AOC one time, she made the point that said when she worked as a waitress, she thought that her wage was all she earned. Meaning like if I am struggling, if I'm in a difficult situation, then this is my lot in life and I've earned this. And she started to realize, well, no, that's a societal choice. Well, the moment that your society realizes, well, wait, these things are political choices and my lot in life is not entirely my own. And you connect that to a certain degree of, like you say, injustice from the standpoint of police and the way that they're engaging the population. And I would even argue that there's already a perspective that police tend to blow off issues of rules and laws and abusive behavior and that type of stuff. So all of this kind of fits within the context of a narrative. One last thing to this, to bolster a point you're saying. Among the people who were working in February, almost 40% in the households making less than $40,000 a year had lost a job in March. That number is astonishing. Mm-hmm. Among 40% of the household, of the people that were working in February that was making less than $40,000 a year, 40% lost a job in March. So basically the people who had the least amount of savings and who were at the bottom of the income scale were one of the disproportionate groups to lose their jobs. And now, it's like the unrest had to come just by virtue of everything else that was going on in our system, right? I mean, this was foreseen.
Right, and they're still pushing these same sorry narratives, even CNN. Oh, there's outside agitators, really, in 75 cities. And let me add this: when they have the March for Life, when they have a Second Amendment march, right? They brag. We got people from all over the country, people from everywhere here. So if it's a right-wing trope, then if it's a right-wing march, it is a badge of honor to have people from all over the place. However, if it's something to do with rights for black people, well, you can only, I guess, what next? It's people from a different zip code. Somehow, if you live outside of the city limits now, you're apparently wrong. The exact opposite standards are applied. When it's black people, you got to live within the jurisdiction, I guess. I don't know. But when it's right wing, let's be proud we have people from everywhere. That's 1960s Bull Connor right there. Outside agitators. We have these Negroes in our area and they're all happy. And some outside agitators are going to come in and tell them, hey, you don't have to accept that stuff. You got constitutional rights.
And they've also added the Russia trope to it. They used to try to say Martin Luther King was working with the communists. And it comes a guy, he's like, hey, I want my people to, have decent housing and to be able to eat. And he's like, oh, that guy's a commie. And so they always used to make this trope that the civil rights movement was somehow going to join with, this kind of communist movement stuff. And they're doing the exact same thing now. They just separated communists from Russia and China.
anything to discount the agency
Yes.
of the people involved, to discount the fact that, because what you're now saying is well, there's no validity to their arguments, to their positions, even though you're not really saying that. You're implying that because from a logical perspective, they could be working for Russia and still be right. The fact that if they were, which of course it's absurd, if they were from a logical, purely logical perspective, that would not affect the validity of their claims. So it's something that appears to be an attack on them, and it's even then it's a faux attack. But it's still, we've got to discount these people. Let's talk about what clothes they have on, what direction they're walking in, how the wind's blowing, who we think may be supporting them. Let's talk about everything except the validity of their claims, because there's no way you can argue against the validity of their claims.
No, they're legit. I mean, with all of the crises that are taking place at the exact same time, you would think that this would be expected. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh God, there's these foreign actors. No, you would expect something like this. You know, I'm curious, with your experience in law enforcement, what does it mean that they're putting Ellison as Attorney General on this case? I mean, I took this as they were serious. That's the way I took it. But how did you see this?
Here's the way I see it. They're scared to death. They're going to the highest possible authority they can. Putting Ellison on this case is sending the message. What they want to do, whatever they can to communicate to the people who are involved, who are protesting, look, please stop. We charging people. Look, he's the highest guy we can possibly find. We're doing everything we can. They want to send the message to the protesters. We're serious about it, and we're going to act, because they recognize something. And I said this earlier, for these people that are like, hey, what you really need to do is crack down. And I said, I've been in the midst of anti all kinds of thing marches. And you know what I realized? I'm standing there with 100 cops and there's 10,000 people around me.
That's right.
If you infuriate those people, if they just start running in the same direction, you're going to get trampled to death. Even without any attempted violence, you have to de-escalate. So what they're coming to realize is that if these people choose, they can burn this country to the ground, and there is absolutely nothing they can do about it. And I got to add this. And Donald Trump is really playing with fire, because he's like, we'll send the troops in. Really? An army that's 60% Black and Puerto Rican, and you're going to send them in for an issue like this?
With
and
weapons.
You think they're going to just mow their own people down? Historically, when a government falls is when there are protests and they say to the army, shoot the people, and the army turns around and looks back at them and says, oh, no, we're not. These are us. At that point, a regime, look at East Germany, look at history. A regime falls when that happens. Donald Trump is playing with fire if he thinks he can send in a 60% Black and Puerto Rican army and tell them to mow down Blacks and Puerto Ricans and white people, mostly white people, I might add, that are protesting against police violence against people of color.
You know, I think yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And I think it might even be worse than that. I mean, if such a stark, example could be made. I think part of the problem is that over the course of like 40, 50 years, the political system has been detached from the public. And so you don't have this thing where the public says, we need this, and the political system says, okay. You have it where it's this assumption that the public is just going to fall in line, do their job, leave the people to the political class to their own devices. And they would go in and they would cut taxes. They would pass these trade deals that would allow them to ship jobs overseas. They would do all of this stuff. The public would watch. But because both systems or both parties basically had this thing kind of sewn up with this kind of corporate control, the public didn't really have a space to do anything. And so the public was stuck in this thing kind of going back and forth without really having an example, and with a political space that just kind of believes we can do whatever we want and the public would accept it because they've accepted it for the last 40, 50 years. But like to your point, the moment that you have a spark and it takes off, and 140 different cities, and then the president of the United States is going to say, okay, now we're going to send in the military to do what? I think the problem is that they realize that with everything that's going on right now, you have a lot of people who are not working. You have a lot of people who are angry. You have a lot of people who can't pay their rent. You have a lot of people who are eating at food banks, who might have had a decent job at one point, but are now working at somewhere like Walmart. Like, you have a lot of stress and almost like canned heat in the way that your society is, with a political system that, because it's been so disjointed for so long, it can't respond to it. And so you have this like worst case scenario going on both ends where, A, it doesn't respond to it, but B, all of a sudden you have a society that is angry and that is demanding X or Y. And am I hitting on that right? I'm trying to get at this point of how you have a public that wants something and is angry about it and a political system that basically doesn't care.
Well, I'll go one further. What if we say it's not a political system that's apathetic towards the public's needs? It's openly hostile towards the public's needs. Let me give you an example. Recently on 60 Minutes, Jay Powell, the guy who runs the Fed, comes on and says, the checkbook is open. He basically says, I think the Congress should give money to the people. Hey, the check is open. All they got to do is come to me and say, hey, we're going to give the people whatever, $1,000 a month, $2,000 a month. He said basically he didn't care, $10,000. He didn't use the numbers, but he said, my checkbook is open. Tell me what you need, you'll get it. So now Congress is sitting there with no excuses. They could have given Americans whatever they needed just to eat. They had food lines going on. And you know what they did? Nothing. We're going to give more tax cuts to the rich. We're going to give billions of dollars, trillions of dollars to our corporate owners. And they were openly hostile to the most basic needs of food and shelter to the American people. And the American people, those who don't even know the details that I'm saying, intuitively can see, well, wait a minute, there's food lines. We got $13 billion aircraft carriers. They're talking about Venezuela, Iran. Oh, what about the Chinese protests in Hong Kong? Haven't heard much about that lately. But
isn't that funny?
They intuitively know they're getting the shaft. And I don't hear Nancy Pelosi. She's got a $24,000 refrigerators full of $12 a pint ice cream. I don't hear her saying, hey, we got to do something to help the little guy. What about these millennials? They'll never be able to make it.
Think about it for the moment, to put it in perspective, to make that point that much more clear. Medicare for All has an 88% approval rating. 88%. Like if you went to random Democrats, 88%. Even in areas where Sanders lost by like 30, 40 points, like South Carolina or whatever, it still won. And in the middle of a pandemic with 40 million people without health care, Nancy Pelosi is like, yeah, we'll put the Cobra. I'm telling you, nobody who's ever used Cobra likes Cobra. And you still have Joe Biden who said, yeah, I'd veto Medicare for All. Again, 88% approval. I think this kind of gets to the point of like how, like you said, they're openly hostile to what the public wants, even for their own party. I mean, if indeed your political space was attentive to your needs, how do you ignore a policy that has basic unanimity in regards to support? I find it to be utterly astonishing. And yet this perpetuates itself. I'm curious, what do you think is going to take place with this? Where do you think this goes? Is this the beginning of a revolution, or is this going to be quelled at some point? Like, because I think if it's going to change into something else, it has to take on a different form. Meaning, it can't just be specific to race. It has to be this meeting between this kind of race and class, where both of those things, even if they're not entirely understood, but they're working in some kind of tandem. Because the chaos is economic and racial. It's not one or the other. It's both.
Right. Yeah. You see the signs out there. You see signs at these protests that say, bail out people, not the banks. You see the signs that let you know this is not just about race whatsoever. Here's what I think. This is not stopping anytime soon. So one of two things is going to happen. It wouldn't surprise me if the government tries to crack down, but I think that they are looking at it. And let's not forget, if you're in a particular congressional district, which almost all of them, they're having some uprisings. Now, what's going to happen? People are going to run against you, and they're going to say, hey, that guy didn't do anything for you, but I will, and they will beat you. If nothing else, out of self-preservation, I think some of these members of Congress are going to get scared, and they're going to say, okay, we need to do something. I think they're going to be forced. And as so many people have said, the only reason they will ever act will be out of self-preservation. And let's not forget, I got another prediction, and I'll say it again. End of July, the unemployment insurance runs out, and Congress and people are going to be millions, literally tens of millions of people are going to be facing, and that's not exaggeration, facing eviction. Yeah. They're going to expect Congress. They're going to be like, okay, Congress is going to do something. Congress ain't going to do nothing. Congress will leave them to die. Or does anyone out there think that we're going to have any kind of a country standing if you got tens of millions of families wandering the street hungry? I think not. They'll tear this. This is the beginning. If Congress does not act to deal with the economic issues, they will tear this country limb from limb.
I would be shocked that Congress acts. I would be shocked.
Me too.
That's how cynical I am in regards to the way our political system operates. And I think you're right. Like, I was shocked that this hadn't happened before now, if I'm being dramatic, completely honest with you, but here we are. I have to be honest, I didn't necessarily know how to feel about this. Part of my feeling was good. There needs to be a balancing, or there needs to be a leveling off, because you can't necessarily continue to injure and then your society kind of looks at this stuff and just kind of gives it a pass without having any consequence for it. It makes it feel, or it makes it come across implicitly that elements of your society don't matter as much as other elements. So we can kill this group and, the world will just go on. We're not going to prosecute or anything else. I'm curious, from your experience working in the police force, what would be the changes necessary to deal with this? Like if they actually, say for the moment, Congress say, you know what, we're actually going to take real legitimate change to try to make sure this doesn't happen again. How do
there are a couple of things that must happen. I made this point a while back, and that was when John Brennan was caught on the CIA. John Brennan was caught. They were being investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee, and it was found out that the CIA hacked into the Senate Intelligence Committee computer while the Senate Intelligence Committee was investigating the CIA. And John Brennan, they said it wasn't happening. It was found out that he was lying. I'm going somewhere with this. It was found out that he was lying, and Congress then said, okay, you lied. You can investigate yourself. Everybody knows how that's going to turn out. Nobody thought that if the CIA was up to no good and the CIA investigated themselves, that it would be a legitimate investigation. Here's where I'm going with that. There must be federal law that when police departments are involved in violence, involved in illegalities, that there are separate entities, maybe in the Attorney General's office for the state, whatever, there are separate entities that are investigating police departments. You cannot allow police departments to investigate themselves. It is absurd and naive to believe that you will ever get a fair investigation. Let's not forget, Marilyn Mosby, the state's attorney for Baltimore City, after the Freddie Gray investigation, said, you know what? The internal affairs investigators for the city of Baltimore were acting as members of the defense team for the officers that were accused. That happens every single time. So here's the bottom line. For starters, you must take away the ability of police departments to investigate themselves. You're talking to a person that was in charge of investigations, in charge of internal investigations. And I'm going to send some guy who went to the academy with Jamal Thomas, who is in a bowling league with Jamal Thomas. Jamal Thomas is accused of wrongdoing, and I'm going to send this guy out to investigate Jamal Thomas, and I think that I'm going to get a fair investigation. No, that's number one. That's a huge one. And that's something that, let me add this. And the investigative unit, say you put it in the state's attorney general's office, cannot under any circumstances include retired police officers. Because if you say, okay, we've got a new unit in the AG's office and they're going to investigate police officers, what are they? Retired police officers. You've done the same thing.
Yeah.
So that's something that is a must. To get anything, to go anywhere here, that has to be started.
We have about a minute and a half left, and I want to get to something real quick that Donald Trump said. So you're a member of the ACLU's National Board of Directors. So Trump made this comment about Antifa declaring them a terrorist organization. What effect would that have in creating or calling basically a decentralized organization that's not really an organization, a terrorist group?
Here's what I think. It's absurd. It's unconstitutional. Trump's an idiot, and he doesn't even realize that. That's just heated rhetoric for his base, and they'll all go, yay, because they think there's like 1 trillion Antifa people. That's one of the far right's boogeymen. Antifa, they're all coming to get us, and they're everywhere. There's Antifa. It was rhetoric for his base. It's unconstitutional. There's no real such thing as Antifa. It's, quote, a leaderless movement. It's a hashtag. So that was rhetoric for his base.
Yeah, that's what I figured. But you can't always tell with Trump. Sometimes he does odd and out there things. With that, we're out of time. Garland, co-host the Fault Lines here on Radio Sputnik. Thank you. Absolutely, thank you for joining us on the show, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Absolutely. You guys are listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We'll be back in a moment.
above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? If you're tired of a superficial and shallow reporting for the mainstream media, here's your alternative. Forget the spoon-fed sound bites from pundits who know so little about so much. We deal with real issues. War in the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, U.S.-Russian relations, the rise of China, austerity, mass migration, global warming, and social justice movements in the United States and around the world, and much more. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardroom of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for chance speak and are heard loud and clear. 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am typically here with my co-host Bob Schlehuber, but he is on vacation right now. If you guys are digging what we're putting down, definitely give us a like, share the content. You can also reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So over the weekend, I followed social media rather closely as I observed the protests taking place in the various states. I wanted to keep track of all of them. I was shocked, though, when media uncritically ran with the narrative early on that the protests were from outside agents, people coming from outside of the state, outside of the localities that are basically ginning up all of this chaos. Now, I said before that protests took place in 140 cities all across the United States, so that is a lot of outside agitators. Fortunately, a close friend of the show was at the protests in Minnesota and is available to report what he observed from the actual people who were on the ground. We are fortunate to be joined by good friend Eugene Perrier, journalist with Breakthrough News, who has been on the ground in Minneapolis all weekend. Eugene, how's it going, man? You doing all right?
I'm definitely doing all right. I'm doing well. I appreciate you, Jamal. I'm very excited to be here with you.
Absolutely. I am excited to have you here. I haven't seen you since you were with By Any Means Necessary, so I am glad that you were willing to come on to the show. I'm curious, what's the feeling on the ground there? You've been on the ground in the various areas that the protests have been taking place, basically ground zero. What has been taking place? Have there been outside agitators, or were these actual people who were actually there who were very upset at what had taken place?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head. These were definitely actual people who were very upset. I mean, the outside agitators sort of meme, of course, as you know well, Jamal, has a long history. I mean, I certainly wasn't checking people's IDs out there, but I was talking to a lot of people, and without any doubt, the bulk of people who have been on the streets in Minneapolis, both in the daytime and in the nighttime, are indeed from Minneapolis. And many people, I did see some cars set on fire. I saw some windows broken, and absolutely, that was a diverse group of people. I'll say it like that. I mean, it clearly was not some sort of plot that was ginned up. I talked to some people who were in and around those actions. And really, the feeling on the ground here, and last night, for instance, I was at George Floyd's memorial. There's like a memorial kind of just shrine that's been set up in a little bit of a 24-hour vigil right around where he was killed. And there's just an extreme sense of indignation. And many people, from the African-American community, from African immigrant communities, told me over and over again that this felt to them like just a continuation of so many other incidents that they'd seen in the past, that there was huge frustration. There's a lot of feeling about the DA here, and I know he's now had the Chauvin case taken away from him. That's given to Keith Ellison, but nevertheless, there's a strong feeling I heard from many people, both in the streets and just in the neighborhoods, that he is consistently downgrading and doing nothing in incidents of police murders and police killings, and that he essentially has been complicit in many of the past incidents. So I think there's a feeling of despair, of anger, of outrage. And one thing I heard quite significantly, sort of even from many people who were critical of the quote unquote rioting that was going on, or the rebellion or uprising, was what else can people expect? I mean, I heard that from many people. What else do people expect? What else do people expect? I even had someone tell me that, they kind of ripped what was going on and said, I think this is terrible. People shouldn't be doing this. But at the end of the day, they aren't the ones who started it. Like, the reason this is happening is because incidents like this take place, no one does anything, and there's no substantive change. So a lot of outrage on the ground. Certainly, there are people here from other states, for sure, who are here in solidarity. So, I mean, I'm not going to say that there's, no one here from any other state, but there's certainly no indication at all of any sort of organized out-of-state plot or anything like that. I mean, that just totally does not comport with what I've seen in the streets.
Yeah, and it doesn't entirely make logical sense. I mean, 140 cities. Like, where are all of these foreign outside agitators coming from? And even if there were, assume for the moment, even that if that was true, those people just didn't have anywhere in their own location to go to. They were still upset by what actually took place. You know what I mean? Like, it was still people in the U.S. who were greatly bothered. There's something I want to hit on, though, that you mentioned. What are people supposed to do? So when I looked at, as I was watching all of this take place, and I was seeing the police station set on fire in the cars, and I thought that was satisfying. Looting less so, but the cop car is satisfying. I wasn't looking at violence, the rioting, the protests. I looked at all of that stuff as being a natural extension of inequality, of basically killings without consequence. And those things have pent up over the last 40, 50 years without necessarily any kind of resolve or resolution of it. That's kind of the way I saw it. In the way that people were talking about it on the ground, what lens were they viewing this through, if that makes sense? Were they viewing this through entirely like class? Are they viewing this through race only? Or did you find, especially with the different cultures and the different people who are there, this kind of interplay between race and class playing out throughout the protests?
I would say very much an interplay between the two. And I think the sort of the juxtaposition of the police murder protest and the so-called looting, I think very much brought that to the forefront, because many people I think are recognizing that, sure, I'm sure there's probably some people out there, whatever, who aren't suffering poverty or whatever it may be, but that to a large extent, there are many different people in many different communities, especially the African-American community in this country, that are disproportionately suffering from poverty, from unemployment. I even heard someone say, this was sort of people getting their own second stimulus check, and which I thought was pretty interesting. But I think that was sort of the lens that people were bringing to it, is that they feel that there's just a globalized, not in the sense of the world, but globalized in the sense of all the issues, sort of package of exploitation and oppression that so many of these communities are subject to. And also worth noting here, of course, the Somali community, which is very large, has been heavily targeted over the years by the FBI in these counterterrorism investigations, allegedly trying to uproot al-Shabaab or whatever it may be. So there's also a long history of, I think, multiple levels of police repression, multiple levels of state and intelligence activity and things that have really been pushing down. But it's very clear in the context of what's happening and the people I'm talking to that it's not just the issue of race per se, although, of course, that's a relevant issue, but the way these issues intersect, of course, is almost so difficult to entangle that you can see the feelings, and maybe to speak even a little bit more to it, the vast majority of people I talk to who are from the African-American community, especially who are out here, are working class people who just, feel fed up with the overall situation. I think, several people mentioned to me just the context of COVID-19 disproportionately affecting African-Americans and how that reflected some realities of poverty and lack of access to resources. So it's a very strong current here. And I think many people may have seen the Minneapolis NAACP president. She spoke several days ago on this exact issue. She says not a riot, it's an uprising. She said Trump is talking about, he's going to send in all this national help, but we still don't even have masks for COVID-19. And just making a point about how working class people have consistently been left in the lurch in many of these communities, immigrant and Black and other communities of colors, Native American community, large here in Minneapolis, and that issue is really heavily overlaid with the issue of police violence and police brutality.
It really is an interplay. I mean, it really is, that the combination between those 2 points. I used to point to people and say, you realize even though Eric Garner might have been killed because he was Black, nobody, if he was making $20 an hour, he wouldn't have been on the street selling looses in the first place to even allow that interaction to take place. In my head, issues of class can't get rid of issues of race. It's more so you can kind of ameliorate it to some degree by getting rid of those rough edges between the two sides. How do you view this? Because I know you were on By Any Means Necessary, And that show had a that specific kind of class racial analysis of politics that all seems to come to a head right here, all at once in Minneapolis.
I really appreciate that question because I think, it's the challenge of framing. And from my point of view, if we we have to go back to the original root and the original purpose of why this racist white supremacist system was set up. And that was basically to help create a labor control system. And so at the end of the day, this is not just sort of like some accidental prejudice. Now, of course, after 400 years, there's a lot of sort of just independent, subjective prejudice that exists out in society. But at the end of the day, when you look at the fact that you can have a black president, all these black faces in high places, and still in pretty much every single social indicator see significant disparities. I think what people, really should look at is that there is a pillar foundational role of racism and white supremacy as a pillar of capitalism, and that of course maybe in the abstract you can have capitalism without racism, but in the reality of America, the way this country has run for so many years is using the black population, one as a source originally of super exploited laborers, people you could pay less or whatever. Now obviously we're in a very different situation, and I always say the difference between slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration is slavery and Jim Crow were about keeping people working, and mass incarceration is about what happens when they've decided they're going to remove all the jobs and they don't really need you any much, but hey, you're still here. And I think that when we look at it like that, it's easier to understand why these issues are so intractable, even in a moment where, even Richard Spencer now says, oh, I'm not a racist. No one wants to be called a racist, but yet there's still so many obviously racial disparities that exist, and they can't just be wiped away or pushed away or moved away, because at the end of the day, it really is something that is essential to the ability of this capitalist system to keep running, is to be able to have all these different little subdivided subsections of the labor force that are exploited at differing levels, and that because of all these differences often are struggle to come together amongst themselves and present a united fight against sort of the same basic enemy. So that's kind of how I've always seen how those issues interplay.
Yeah, I'm curious, from speaking to the people there, how do they feel about all of these protests basically erupting across the country and around the world? I mean, you've had people in Berlin and London, New Zealand. New Zealand is 25 hours away. I mean, there seemed to be this kind of solidarity movement across the world, not just in the U.S.
People are very excited. I mean, when I was out there Friday night, pretty late at night, someone who was on a bullhorn started reading off things that were happening in different cities and around the world, and big cheers went up. I talked to some people last night at the George Floyd Memorial about how they were feeling about it, and people were really excited. I mean, I heard from a lot of people, especially in the African American community here, that they had felt like they were kind of unknown, that the black community in Minneapolis, people didn't know that Minneapolis, that they've just been overlooked basically, and that they really feel that this is their time for people to see yes, there are black people in Minneapolis. Yes, we are facing a lot of the same problems. And yes, we are willing to stand up and push back and to fight back. And so I think it's actually been tremendously validating here from people I've been talking to on the ground to see Berlin, to see London, to see New Zealand, because they really feel seen and heard in a way I think they haven't felt seen. And also things around the country that they're feeling that they haven't felt seen and heard in a long time. And in fact, most people I've talked to are very open to people coming from other places to show solidarity too. Yeah. I mean, I've certainly heard people, who are upset, feeling that people are coming and doing violence, but many people are very happy to have people coming and helping and participate in the different protests that are happening, because again, they really feel like, yes, this is a validation that we exist, that we are here, and that our struggle is just.
I can imagine. I like I said, I saw those protests and my thought was yes. And, like I said, it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be function within the lines, but it's one of those things where you have a certain expectation that after a while, the public would respond, and you almost have to respond in order to kind of create a balancing between those things. But with that, we're out of time. Eugene, journalist with the Breakthrough News. Eugene, where can we find more of your news and analysis?
You can check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at BT, the letters BT Newsroom.
Very cool. Thank you for joining us again. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in DC. We'll be back after this.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas, usually here with my vacationing co-host Bob Schlehuber. Bob will be back tomorrow. He's doing perfectly fine. We still have lots to cover over the hour, including the media's coverage of many of the tragedies that avail this nation. As always, we want your chats, calls, tweets. You can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Also, give us a like if you are indeed digging the content and share this video. Now, tell me something. If you're an exceptional nation, hell, even indispensable, the very nation that keeps the other world on its axis, how do you explain losing 100,000 people, 40 million jobs, and now being inundated with protests and riots that are sweeping across 140 nations or states or cities all across your country? Because the force that was supposed to protect and serve keeps murdering unarmed civilians. To put this in perspective, being in your own home hasn't ensured your safety. And for that matter, being in your home hasn't ensured your safety. And we have multiple stories of cops either blazing into somebody's room with guns blazing, or for that matter, shooting someone in their home from their window. If you're a part of the mainstream media of the exceptional nation, how do you explain that? Meaning, if you're looking at all of the tragedies that have availed this nation, with all of the fires being set across the United States right now as we speak, including at the Capitol itself in Washington, D.C., how does the media explain all of these issues in a nation that is supposed to be exceptional and indispensable? 2 words: Russia, China. Yes, Russia and China. To discuss media's handling of simultaneous catastrophes, we are joined by Brianna Griffith, producer of the host of People's Republic, to talk about the latest. Brianna, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Always glad to be on.
Absolutely. So I would imagine you were probably glued to your set, or at the very least to some kind of media where you were watching the protests that were taking place over the weekend. And every so often, I would hear like a CNN episode or MSNBC episode where they would discuss this, or they would bring on some official, and the official invariably would use this foreign agitator stuff. But Susan Rice kicked it up a notch. Let's hear the clip of Susan Rice talk about the Russians,
who have come to try to hijack those protests and turn them into something very different. And they are probably also, I would bet, based on my experience, I'm not reading the intelligence today or these days, but based on my experience, this is right out of the Russian playbook as well. But we can't allow the extremists, the foreign actors, to distract from the real problems we have in this country that are long-standing, centuries old, and need to be addressed responsibly by new leadership.
Brianna,
You're absolutely right on the.
How exactly are the Russians involved in this? Just so we're clear, did the Russians have anything to do with 100,000 people dying from COVID-19? Did they have anything to do with incompetence leading to 40 million people without a job or without health care, like 1/4 of the workforce? And for that matter, with cops and state not prosecuting people who basically abuse and shoot African Americans. But Susan Rice is saying that this has to do with the Russians. How are the Russians getting involved in this situation?
I mean, I was at the protest in Austin the past couple days. I did not hear anyone speaking Russian. I did not see anyone who was a foreign agitator. I mean, it's absolutely absurd, and it seems like this whole Russiagate conspiracy theory it's gone from first as tragedy, then as farce, but not like second, third, fourth time as farce. I mean, it's truly something incredible. I have no idea how they're able to keep a narrative up like that with a straight
It really
face.
is jumping the shark. I mean, like because it's one thing if something happens out of nowhere. I think part of this comes because the United States uses methods like this around the world. Like, so we would, if you think back to the story that took place in Venezuela, maybe a month ago, I think it was a little bit less than a month ago, where you had these guys from Silver Corps going, trying to topple the government, and basically they were going to ransack military bases and create an uprising. Now, immediately after that took place, what do you think the U.S. would have done? The U.S. would have turned around and said, hey, we need to protect those freedom-loving fascists that are trying to take down the government of Venezuela. We did it in Libya, we did it in Syria, and all of these nations, Ukraine, in Hong Kong, all of those places where there's some sort of an uprising, oftentimes you'd have some kind of aid package or like or for some kind of like U.S. aid or something working behind the scenes that is dumping money into various organizations that helps that stuff pop off. I mean, we were doing the same thing in Western Europe, where Operation Gideon was produced, where we were basically having all of these countries where we had like paramilitary organizations in the various countries in order to create uprisings. And now it comes home to roost. And their first response is, it has to be the Russians or the Chinese. Do you think that's where that comes from? Meaning, it's one of those things of you know your own behavior and you just kind of assume the rest of the world is behaving in tandem like you're behaving.
I mean, it's hard to like. I think it's pretty clear to both the corporate media and sort of the political establishment of the U.S. But the protests here have nothing to do with Russia or with China. The question is always like, are they deceiving themselves or are they just simply trying to like throw that deceit out onto other people? And to me, it seems to ring hollow. I mean, sure, some of these mainstream journalists, some of these corporate journalists may have convinced themselves that this has something to do with Russia or China. If that's the case, then it's because they weren't on the ground at any of these. But I mean, this is just really, in many ways, like sort of the response to the natural contradiction, not natural contradictions, but the social, political, and economic contradictions of U.S. society finally coming to a head, finally, exploding in
real time.
The kind of way.
Yeah, all at once. I mean, with multiple tragedies. Like, I think the mechanism of the country could withstand a Donald Trump if nothing else went wrong. Like if if the mechanisms just kind of ticked along, nothing else was going wrong, there wasn't a pandemic, fair enough. But the moment where you need competent leadership, then you have a problem. Because if you look back at some of the military conflicts that we've had in the past, where like a John F. Kennedy got us out, we barely got out the skin of our teeth with people who were relatively competent. And you have a pandemic, you have a racial crisis where the president, as opposed to being a conciliatory figure, is out there basically saying we're going to be shooting protesters. And then you have all of these people who are also out of a job, who are going to be evicted, who are at food bank. This seems like a recipe for disaster. I'm curious on whether or not they have to know this. Like, I don't believe for a moment that they believe that the Russians and the Chinese are intimately involved in this. Or am I just wrong on this? Or am I not cynical enough in my perspective of this? I always think, are they lying or are they basically in the dark? From your standpoint, are they lying or are they in the dark?
I mean, I think that there's always, when you repeat a lie enough times, when you repeat like what's clearly deceptive or misleading line like that enough times, eventually you start to some degree, believe your own lies. I think the prime example of that would be like the Trump administration honestly believing they could just overthrow the government of Venezuela with, like basically the Venezuelan way of taking. Like the Trump administration and sort of others within the U.S. Ruling establishment have legitimately deceived themselves into believing that they could that Venezuela was, on the verge of collapse, et cetera, when it was not. And so they went forward with it, and it was a complete disaster. I think this is a different case. I think this is entirely or mostly, overwhelmingly it's outward facing. Overwhelmingly, they're sort of, saying that, I guess to they're like kind of clueless, like whatever white liberal audience is sort of not wanting to be involved with any of these protests. Whatever the case is, like whoever it is who's sitting there watching CNN and not really engaging politically with like the political moment, I believe that, but I don't believe for a second that that at sort of the top levels of corporate media that anyone really believes that at all. Maybe simply use to continue to heighten tensions against China and Russia to sort of push that geopolitical struggle there, but it's not something that I think they believe themselves at all.
I don't think they believe that either. And it goes to this whole discrediting of the media. I mean, I think it was Friday, if I'm not mistaken, Friday or Saturday, where they basically attacked CNN in Atlanta, Georgia. and they basically painted CNN and all this stuff. They were throwing stuff at it. They were breaking the windows. I wonder if this has something to do with this discrediting of media. If you think back to what media talks about, it's often just kind of things that are not entirely like in line with what the public needs or what the public wants. It is the weirdest thing in the world where you have all of these people who are going to lose their houses, and media is talking about China. You know what I mean? Like, it's the most bizarre thing in the world. All of these crises are taking place that are directly from the factors and the mechanisms in the United States. Like you said, the heightening of the contradictions all at once. And their response is to not really have a good analysis of this at all. Even Van Jones. Van Jones made that argument about white liberals. And they pissed off a lot of people, actually, who consider themselves Hillary supporters. But Van Jones, even in his analysis, misses out on that class element of this. Like, it just seems like they always have something that's missing from their analysis of it, where they can't get their hands around it. Is that a blind spot is that a natural blind spot, or is that a forced blind spot? If that makes sense. Like, is this a class blind spot, or is this a blind spot where they intentionally just kind of run with?
I think, I mean, really, all media has kind of its biases, its blind spots, its whatnot. Like, all media essentially has a class alignment of some sort or another. So long as there are class distinctions within any given society, the media, any given media apparatus will really be kind of, siding with the class distinctions or the ideological alignment of the class that's either funding them or supporting them. And so, yeah, naturally, like a corporation like CNN, given all the time in the world to do the research to really try and get the facts on the ground, can never really come up with the level of class analysis that I think working class people, have. And that's why it's like so important that we have like actually journalists with like working class media outlets and journalists who have that kind of more like working class activist bent, and who understand certain sections of class, race, gender, et cetera, and who are clear like which side of that struggle they're on, to get the true story. Because the corporate media will always kind of pretend to like this impartiality that they're not able to really, that they're not able to back up.
Impartiality. I love that. Because it's always, it's like there's no such thing, right? I mean, basically, you have different perspectives that are always tethered to something. There's always somewhat of a dishonesty, even in making the framing of I'm being impartial as I make this argument. One of the things that came out recently was Obama telling people to vote. And Democrats say this all the time. Go vote. Go vote. If you guys don't like it, go vote. And you kind of make the point, it's like, but vote for who? Donald Trump is talking about shooting protesters, and Joe Biden was literally constructed the crime bill. He named it the Biden crime bill. And I have all sorts of clips and videos of Joe Biden saying, I don't care what your upbringing was. I don't care how difficult your life was. I don't care. Lock them up. Who do you vote for in this? And I would argue, honestly, can't you even make the argument that the fact that we don't have either party to vote for is the reason why this much chaos is taking place right now?
I mean, what we're seeing is that essentially like the Democratic, usually the Democratic like urban centers here, such as Austin versus the Republican, states, the Republican state entities, all across the country are really on the same side of a lot of these issues. The blue and red ultimately are both kind of essentially in alignment with the police in many, many ways. They both exacerbated the same problems. And we're really seeing that now when sort of both the city level officials in a lot of these major urban areas across the country, who are supposed to be the kind of liberal progressives, versus the usually more progressive or more regressive, like openly regressive, openly reactionary state governments. I mean, they're sending in essentially forces usually from all across the state. A lot of times they're sending in National Guard or other like police departments, whatever the case is. Exactly, it's for who. I know in our city in Austin, in a few months, it's coming up where we have kind of an input period on the police budget. And so I think the maximum amount that we're allowed to suggest that the police budget be lowered is something like 5% of the total police budget. That's the window. That's the window of voting. There is like, do we want to lower the police budget up to 5% or not? This thing, police budget, that's ballooned out of control. And it's just like, I don't see where electorally. Like, I haven't heard really anything out of city council. I think that's the case in a lot of cities across the country that I'm hearing from. And it's just like it's not a realistic option to solve the problems here. And when I do vote, when I vote for the third party, the independent candidates who I really believe and who I really support, I'm told then that I'm spoiling the vote. So, like, there is no option within this quote-unquote legitimate electoral route that will get the changes they actually need.
Yeah, they basically created a system where they've excluded inability for the public itself to get anything accomplished in real terms. Like, if the public says we want Medicare for all, it doesn't matter. They say, yeah, we're going to give you COBRA. Or if the public says we want to expand Social Security, or we want to get rid of student debt, doesn't matter. We don't want to do that. We're not going to do that. And like you said, in criminal justice, same thing. We don't like cops murdering the civilian population. Yeah, we don't really have anything to do with that either, with the exception of hand-wringing. They've basically made it almost impossible to actually have any real legislative reform or resistance that gets anything real significant accomplished, either on the standpoint of criminal justice, economics, any of these issues, just based on the way the political system has been captured by that corporate cash. It's like, what, 90% of the elections are won by the side with the most cash? It's like, who do you lean towards if when you're running in a race, the overwhelming majority of the parties that win are the ones who get paid? I just don't know where this turns out. What happened in Texas? So you're in Austin. What was it like on the ground there? I mean, these protests had swept all across the United States. Austin was one of the locations.
So I think Austin, specifically yesterday, was sort of the perfect, it was the perfect example of sort of the limitations of, again, what is considered quote unquote legitimate, forms of dissent and whatnot. So, like, basically the coalition had called what was supposed to be kind of a rally at the Capitol grounds, the Texas State Capitol grounds, and it was then going to lead into a march. So they had secured all the proper, my understanding, they had secured all the proper protest permits, they had talked to all the right people, et cetera, et cetera. And the morning of, people arrived at the Capitol grounds. DPS had closed off the whole thing. DPS was not letting anyone, including the organizers, on the Capitol grounds. The event wound up technically canceled. And it's kind of ironic because I was actually prepared to give a speech at the event talking about, how all kind of legitimate forms of dissent had been, had been exhausted and weren't getting anywhere. And DPS, that's Texas Department of Public Safety, they proved that in practice by just not letting anyone do the protest.
That's astonishing. Legitimate dissent. I love this. Because it gets to this whole thing of, well, wait a minute, if you're dissenting, no state is going to want you to dissent. And so the notion of legitimate dissent is always going to be some level of dissent that doesn't really challenge the power structure of the state. Like, I'm enamored by those words. What was I'm curious, what was going to be the thesis of your speech in regards to the way you were going to make that argument about how legitimate dissent has basically been squashed to levels of irrelevance, requiring something more?
I mean, I think generally, like, what I was going to say is basically kind of that, as well as, as well as sort of pointing out that the police budget continues to rise every year and every year and every year. Currently, Austin Police Department takes up over 40% of the entire city budget. Meanwhile, again, our communities are struggling just to put food on the table. Our communities are completely behind on rent, deeply in debt, and yet, instead of solving any of this, like the budget, the APD city budget, or the Austin city budget rather, continues to go just all toward the cops. And what I was basically going to make the case for is that, the police can't be reformed. They resisted every attempt to be reformed. They publicly feuded with city leaders, with statewide leaders and whatnot who have tried to reform them. And so, if the police can't be reformed, then they need to be abolished. That's the conversation we need to be having. That's which we need to be moving in.
The police need to be abolished. I'm curious, when you were making that, well, you didn't get the opportunity to make that case, I suppose. When they were putting and blocking, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, when they were blocking the protests, were you guys able to go in a different area to protest, or did people still just kind of blow off the fact that they were trying to shut you guys down? I mean, we have something similar where there's a curfew here in D.C. tonight. There was a lot of protests. fires and all over the place in Washington, D.C. The White House or areas near the White House were in flames. And so they're trying to basically quell the protests by putting a 7 p.m. curfew. When you get into these areas of a legitimate protest, I mean, the very fact that they can put in a curfew like this in order to squash what should be somewhat of a right to protest is somewhat problematic, right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me that, the protest happened anyway. The march happened anyway. There were still, the number I saw was about 10,000. And from my point on the ground, that seems about right, though it's so hard to tell because the protest wound up. DPS essentially wound up escalating the situation by closing the protest off on the Capitol grounds. Because if it was on the Capitol grounds, it would have been so much more space. There would have been able to be socially distanced. Because it was pushed out onto the street, all of a sudden, there's, first of all, the greater fear of like the spread of COVID or whatnot, because all of a sudden 10,000 people are packed on the pretty narrow street. But then it immediately began the process of sort of escalating things, because all of a sudden it's now leaderless. All of a sudden there's really like nobody sort of in control, nobody in charge. So it wound up essentially spreading all across downtown Austin. It was at the police. It was at City Hall, and sort of people were marching back and forth in the thousands, and wound up creating a situation on I-35, where I-35, the major interstate that run through Austin, was shut down for some time. At every point, police, both the state-level police and the city-level police, were making active attempts to escalate the situation using tear gas and rubber bullets. And so I think what we're seeing across the country is that, whatever the police are saying about, quote, making things safer, everything they're doing is making things more dangerous for people. Everything they're doing, they are the ones causing the escalation. It's not the protesters causing the escalation. It's overwhelmingly ops all across the country.
That's where I was going to go with that. Because I was watching the various places where they would target journalists. They would target people who were reporters who were on the scene, either with tear gas or with rubber bullets. They didn't care if the people announced who they were, like that they were with the press or anything else. They were still fair game to be targeted. Also, many of the people were saying that the cops were making things worse by escalating from what started off as basically a peaceful protest in the various cities. And you're saying that's basically what you experienced in Austin also.
Absolutely. It was an escalation, and it was, I know we were talking a little bit earlier about these quote unquote outside agitators that every city government is claiming is coming. But like, if there are outside agitators, if there are people who are coming from outside the city limits in order to instigate violence or to create riots, if those exist in Austin, that's where the APD, because overwhelmingly it's the APD. It's also Austin police generally live way outside the city limits. They see themselves as like a military, even in times of quote unquote peace, they see themselves as like an occupying military force that has to, keep down essentially what they see as like the unruly masses here in Austin. That's their mentality. And so, if they're outside agitators, those seem to be the ones.
Or the National Guard in the various states where these guys were shooting people at their front door. I don't know if you saw the clip for that, where the guy was at their front porch and the National Guard comes in basically, saying, light them up, guys. And he's like shooting people at their doors and whatnot. It's utterly insane stuff. We have a caller, DJ. What's going on, DJ?
Hey, how's it going? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I just wanted to say that I feel like one thing that really caused this, is the slavery clause in the 13th Amendment. I feel that this has contributed to the way we process people into the prison system. We have more people locked. We have about 12 million people locked up. There are 20 million people on the continent of Australia. So this is almost an entire continent worth of free labor. And private prisons, oftentimes when they are made in certain nations, in certain states, they have quotas. They say we want you to keep these prisons 90 to 95% occupied, and the states actually mirror that with something called a conviction rate. That means if if 100 people are arrested and they have a 95% conviction rate, 95% of those people need to get arrested. So they're in line with those prisons that are being built. There's free slave labor. It says that slavery is not legal unless it's punishment for a crime. If you get rid of that, that's the big deal. As far as the punishment, as far as the police escalating things, they're only making things worse for themselves. Just going back to the protests. I don't know, can you hear me?
Can you hear me, DJ? Okay, DJ might have dropped. But Brianna, good point, right? I mean, I think I would add one thing to it, and I would say Joe Biden's the crime bill. I mean, the crime bill incentivized imprisonment, and it did so in a way by guaranteeing or by getting states to keep prisoners in office or in jail for like 85% of their time frame. So you basically created a system to incentivize locking people up for longer parts of their sentence, not to mention the disparities between crack and cocaine and these other issues. Brianna, did you want to add anything to DJ's comment?
No, I absolutely agree that that's a huge factor, and I think we also have to understand why, what's commonly called the prison industrial complex came to be. Of course, the earlier kind of colonial system of slavery that lasted up through the 1860s, obviously that was essentially like the early engine that drove capitalism. That was part of the accumulation of capital. Marx talked about and whatnot. But sort of, while the enslavement part's still in there, again, with that 13th Amendment clause in there, the kind of main, I think, reason for it today, the main reason that things, essentially the prison industrial complex was built at the time, was because given the deindustrialization, given the advances in automation that basically made a large percentage of the workforce redundant, the U.S. was facing, at that point, a similar situation where they were genuinely afraid of their massive unemployment rates they believed were going to cause another revolutionary situation. So they started criminalizing so many things that were criminal before. And so essentially the kind of thought process, the kind of analysis, the calculation was made by the U.S. ruling establishment at the time, was essentially that, people can't revolt as effectively if they're all locked up. And I think it's a very simplistic, overview for me, but if people want to read more, there's a actually book by Eugene Furrier called Jacobin Kane, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America, that I think is good for people to check out. But yeah, that's my thoughts on that. I think Paul was absolutely right.
Right on for the name check for Eugene. Eugene was on the show earlier today, so that is a perfect dovetail on that. Excellent. One of the interesting items associated with this. One more thing before we go into the break. We have Brianna is going to be joining us for the next segment also. In Austin itself, I'm curious, when you were on the ground there, how did people frame this? When we were talking to Eugene, about what was taking place on the ground in Minneapolis and how people were, their perspective of it. Because he made the point that it was multicultural, multiracial. You had all sorts of people who were basically there on the ground that were outraged by what was taking place. Did they process it in that context of class and race, or did you find a preponderance of one over the other? Like, with all of these various groups that were on the ground in the various cities, what was your perspective of their arguments that you were hearing as you were talking to the people who were there?
So I was there. I kind of put on the organizer hat more so than my journalist hat, so I didn't get a chance to talk to too many people. But from the people I was talking to, from the chants I was hearing, from just the general atmosphere of overhearing people's conversations and whatnot, I mean, I definitely feel it's the same thing. I think people, whether they're able to really articulate the sort of class and racial and political theory or not, or whether they just understand at an intuitive level, people get that these two things are related. People get that the class and race are absolutely interwoven enough, for sure.
Yeah, they're intrinsically linked. All right, with that, we're joined by Brianna Griffith, producer of the host of People's Republic. Producer and host of People's Republic. You guys are listening to Political Misfits, live in D.C. We'll be back in a moment.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik. Shooting from the left.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here in spirit with my co-host Bob Schlehuber, who's on vacation. He'll be here tomorrow. If you guys dig what we're putting down, please like, share. You can always subscribe to this channel. Also, you can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. We continue to be joined by Brianna Griffith, host of People's Republic, to bash the Sunday news talking heads. This is one of Bob's favorite segments, so hopefully I can do him justice on this. So the Sunday talk shows definitely got the memo that they're supposed to be pushing this line about quote-unquote domestic terrorists and foreign adversaries when it comes to this weekend's protests. Let's start off with our buddy Chuck Todd on Meet the Press. He spoke for some reason with Governor of North Carolina, Pat McCrory, who also served on the Homeland Security Advisory Council in the early 2000s. Now, McCrory pretended to be really sympathetic to the noble, peaceful protesters who are just acting as unwitting human shields for domestic terrorists. Let's hear Pat McCrory.
You do have these groups of anarchists that the governor of Minnesota and the mayor of St. Paul and Minneapolis said very well, and it needs to be exposed. You have a small group of violent people, domestic terrorists, who follow the concept of the art of war. They'll hit and run, they'll break windows, they'll set fires, then they'll run, and even using social media, they'll maneuver around very well-trained police officers who are trained to do riots. And this is why they cause so much destruction within a peaceful protest. It literally only takes 5 to 20 people to cause this destruction and cause this massive call for national guard.
That's former Governor Pat McCrory. Now, anarchists. I love the way he says anarchists. Now, Brianna, how dangerous is this? Now, basically, should we allow public figures to continue to describe vandalism committed during protests as quote-unquote terrorism? And what could be the consequences of basically allowing what is, by all accounts, things that are taking place internally to the country to be considered and cast as terrorists? What are the consequences of that?
I think a lot of that aligns with what's generally going on with the U.S., which is sort of the empire, like the full kind of destructive weight of the U.S. empire is now turned inward. That's not that the U.S. empire wasn't already sort of an internal empire for sure. That black and brown people constitute oppressed nations within the U.S. But it's definitely more overt at this point. And I think the full quote unquote war on terror rhetoric that we heard for so long during the 2000s is now being weaponized once again. We even saw a little bit of that with the initial kind of days of COVID, where all of a sudden like the medical workers were being treated like the troops, and the grocery workers were being treated like the
they were on the front lines, Brianna. Front lines. Yeah, that's a good point. When I hear stuff like this, I find it to be a little terrifying. Only because if we're having a domestic protest, and in that domestic protest, people might vandalize, they might break windows, they might burn property, to call that vandalism when really, whatever you want to think of those actions that the people are taking, it is coming from things that happen internally, and it is protests, whether or not people call it, legitimate protests or not. Terrorism puts a different angle on it that adds, if they're like legal processes that potentially kick in when they're regarding this. For example, when Donald Trump makes this notion that he's going to call Antifa a terrorist group, like there's something problematic with this. But they did this back in 2016 when they said Sanders supporters were being motivated by Russia, and they said the environmentalist movement was being motivated by Russia, and the Black Lives Matter movement was being motivated. Everybody who they didn't like was motivated by Russia, and now we've come around to this weird scenario where the protests over stuff that is literally taking place internally into the country are being blamed on Russia, China, and the nebulous foreign agitators. Like, where does this end? Or does this end? Do these guys still keep pushing this narrative, even though they know it's been entirely discredited over the course of the last 3 years?
It's like, I mean, the war on terror rhetoric that we heard lasted a good, decade or so.
Yes, it did.
And it was able to go that long because it became this sort of like feedback loop with like the U.S. in the guise of defeating something which can't actually be defeated, terrorism, because terrorism is not a place or a thing or a person, wound up creating more situations that then you could call, quote unquote, terrorism. And it seems to be that same sort of thing because like Antifa doesn't exist as an organization. Antifa is not some like vast conspiracy. It's the sort of natural fight back of people. It's a natural, in many ways, the anti-fascist movement has been like sort of this natural fight back of people to the existence of fascism. And, as far as that like calling of people anarchists and whatnot, I'm thinking of like you on the ground at the Austin protest, and they were either trying to keep the homeless population safe. They were defending the homeless population from attacks by anyone who was trying to instigate things. Or some of them were like in the medical tents or whatnot. Like they were actually providing. A lot of them were just providing sort of the kind of safest options for people.
Yeah, the former governor of North Carolina is acting like these guys were political actors. These guys were, to some degree, desperate and angry. There's a difference in those things. George Stephanopoulos takes this up a notch. If the previous one wasn't enough, on This Week, talking to National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. Now, O'Brien worked in all of the cliches with the foreign adversaries to bad apples. Now, George asks O'Brien about a tweet posted by Senator Marco Rubio saying at least 3 foreign adversaries are stoking and promoting violence. Who are these adversaries? Let's hear O'Brien.
Well, Senator Rubio is spot on, and I've seen a number of tweets from the Chinese today that are taking some sort of pleasure and solace in what they're seeing here. And I want to tell our foreign adversaries, whether it's a Zimbabwe or a China, that the difference between us and you is that officer who killed George Floyd, he'll be prosecuted, he'll be investigated, he'll be prosecuted, he'll receive a fair trial. The American people that want to go out and protest peacefully, they're going to be allowed to seek redress from their government. They're not going to be thrown in jail for peaceful protesting.
But they will be thrown in jail for peaceful protesting. And Zimbabwe? He blooded Zimbabwe? So I expect to hear Russia, I expect to hear China, I expect to hear Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, but Zimbabwe? I've never heard Zimbabwe. Now, are we having a conflict with Zimbabwe right now that we just don't know of? Are we about to start one? Is O'Brien just randomly naming countries? Like, O'Brien rambles on here a little bit, saying that the United States won't let quote-unquote bad apples sully the reputation of our quote-unquote heroic police forces, and that we'll get to the bottom of the issue of militant radicals causing destruction out there. This is astonishing. But old George hasn't gotten what he wanted. He wanted that Russia tibbet, damn it, so he goes for it one more time. Like a squirrel with a nut, let's hear George Stephanopoulos go for the Russiagate ratings.
You mentioned China. We also know that Russia has been actively trying in the past to spark racial unrest. Are they one of the adversaries who are now exploiting the situation as well?
Yeah, there may be Russian activists who are doing that, but the difference that I've seen so far is that, for example, we saw a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman trolling the State Department about this. So it's open. It's coming straight from the government. So it's something we're keeping an eye on. But listen, to our adversaries, the American people, we may have our political differences, and we've gone through these crises before, but we'll overcome it. And take a look at what we did yesterday in Florida, sending 2 heroic astronauts into space for the first time in 10 years from American soil on an American rocket. Look, America overcomes, and even in the midst of these crises, we're going to do great things as a country, and our adversaries aren't going to be able to take advantage of this crisis to harm us.
What are we doing right now to counter those adversaries as they try to foment more unrest here in the United States, China, Russia? You mentioned Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe blows me away. And Brianna, he brings in a missile launch or a rocket launch that's not done by, yes, it may be an American company that made the rocket, but in the context of 100,000 people losing their lives, in the context of 40 million people that are out of a job, in the context of all of these people who are not going to be able to make their rent payment next month when their unemployment benefits run out, I don't think people care about the rocket launch. Am I wrong on that? That's insane. That's an insane statement to say. It's so out of touch. Yes, George Stephanopoulos wants that Russiagate stuff. He wants it. He's not going to give it up. Whereas O'Brien is on message, but it just seems so out of touch to say you have 140 country or cities that are in flames, literally. And on top of 140 cities in flames, your White House, outside of your White House, is in flames. You've had people basically rioting and protesting, burning down police stations. 100,000 people have died, literally, no longer on Earth, based on incompetence for the President of the United States. And the government itself has been completely unresponsive in dealing with those issues in any real terms. And he's telling me about a rocket launch? What is wrong with these people? They're gone.
That's incredible. I mean, last time Whitey was on the moon, we got the song, we got the poem Whitey on the Moon. So it's given the level of just absolute error that people are experiencing at this growing chaotic police state. Who cares about that rocket launch? I remember hearing about it. I remember somebody telling me on Facebook, "Hey, this just happened." Both of us are just like, "Ooh," both of us just like, "Ooh, it's a thing that happened."
Do you know how sad it is that the indispensable nation, the exceptional nation, has to claw at a rocket launch? We put a man on the moon, 40, 50 years ago? And he's like, we send a person up to the space station, we're going to survive, we're America. And it's like, dude, is that what you're grasping? That's so shallow of a thing to grasp at in the face of all of this other stuff. What should George Stephanopoulos been asking him? Meaning, if you're going to have this guy here, you're going to ask him these questions about the foreign adversaries, foreign actors. What should have been the questions that you're going to actually ply this guy with, as opposed to keep continuously pushing out, hey, Russia's doing something right, Russia's doing something right? Where should he have been going with this interview?
I mean, the first question I would ask is, show me the evidence that anything that's being caused that anything that's going on in the country right now, show me the evidence that somehow Russia or China or Zimbabwe now caused that. Is there evidence that, is there actual hard evidence that Russia and China are behind this, or is it just all insinuation? Because if the only thing is that Russia and China are criticizing the U.S. for the brutal crackdown on working class Black and brown populations, that's not
involvement.
you're allowed to do.
And we do it all the time. We attack governments all the time. Yeah, it's what we do. It's the weirdest thing in the world. With that, we're out of time. Brianna Griffith, producer of host of People's Republic. I want to thank you again for joining Political Misfits. You're always welcome onto the show. Brianna, where can we find more of your information, or where can we find more of your political analysis?
You can find People's Republic on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. You can also find us on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, wherever podcasts are potted, by typing in People's Republic. And I just want to thank you again for having working class sort of activists and journalists actually there on the ground, to talk about these things.
Very cool. Thank you for joining us at Political Misfits, live from Washington, D.C., and in the immortal words of President Obama.
You check top.
the most important hour of the day. It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am not here with Bob Schlehuber today. However, I am here with our producer, Mrs. Whitty. Whitty, what's going on?
Hey, how are you, Jamal?
So far, so good. I'm alive and kicking. We have about 15 more minutes, give or take. So we have a few more stories for the day. We don't have to, we have the global protests, of course, but there are stories that are beyond the global protests. So what's on the agenda for today?
Well, we can talk about Julian Assange. We can talk about prison labor in meatpacking plants. We could talk about some polls, or we could just rip up former President Barack Obama's insipid Medium post to protesters. Where do you want to start?
Let's go there. Let's go with Obama. Now, what did Obama say?
I mean, yeah, we mentioned this before. He put this post up earlier. It's this Medium post where he tries to bring his usual calm, rational, and sympathetic voice to our national crisis. And it's just, we're all starting to see through this. I mean, so he starts off by saying that the outrage and anger of the people on the streets is absolutely justified and legitimate, and he's not trying to take away from it at all or anything like that. So it's like, okay, all right, great, thank you, Barack Obama. But always his ultimate message over and over is we have to model the code that we want to see our cops abide by. And I honestly I don't know how you can see this effective. I don't know what the code is to just lie down and die.
Yeah.
The thing is it's sort of mealy-mouthed garbage, really doesn't do anything. But more, I think, offensively, is he says, okay, go and march, do what you want to do out in the streets. And here's the quote, but eventually aspirations have to be translated into specific laws and institutional practices. In a democracy, that happens when we elect government officials who are responsive to our demands. And I just have to say, so wait, your party and probably you, coordinated this one-by-one domino dropout so that we could be brought Joe Biden, as the Democratic nominee, as the only viable alternative to Donald Trump. And sorry, what has Joe Biden demonstrated himself to be responsive to? Because I can see that Medicare for All, for example, is an extremely popular policy. Every poll shows that consistently. What do Americans want? They want a different healthcare system. What do they want? They want Medicare for All. What's Joe Biden's response been so far, Jamal?
I'd veto Medicare for All if Medicare for All was passed. And by the way, to make that point that much more clear, when Obama was in office, remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Hillary Clinton was trying to run away from that plan like nobody's business. She couldn't get away from it fast enough. And Obama was like, yep, I'm going to still do it. He was a lamed up president. Still, every time he would get in front of a mic, yes, I'm going to push through the TPP. Yes, I'm going to push through the TPP. And it was dramatically unpopular. Obama didn't care one iota. So, yeah, this notion of responsive government, I don't know what that is.
Well, and also he says, he continues to say, and many people think that voting is only about voting every 4 years for president. But, and here's another quote, the elected officials who matter most in reforming police departments and the criminal justice system work at the state and local levels. So, he wants people to take time out of their busy lives to not only vote for the president and vote for their members of Congress, but also to vote state and local levels. And of course, I'm not here to tell people not to vote for local officials. But it is also not as though we don't have the same problems at a local level that we do at a federal level. Jamal, I don't think you were living in D.C. at the time, but maybe 2 years ago now, we had a citywide referendum on raising the minimum wage for restaurants to $15. They voted on it. D.C. Council? Never mind. Never mind that. Never mind we had a referendum. It passed. You're all supposed to pay your restaurant workers the minimum.
They blew off the referendum? Are you serious? They blew off the referendum?
Yeah, they just said, nope, never mind. We're not going to do it. They got pushback from developers and restaurant owners who didn't want to do it. So it's like, well, again, tried. People went out and voted for it. They tried. And it doesn't work. And it's enforced as it works, preventing people from having what they clearly express as their desires. So, thank you for these several paragraphs, Obama, but it's not going to work.
It rings so hollow. I mean, it really does. I mean, Obama chose Joe Biden of everybody. Now, Joe Biden was, like you said, a constructor of the crime bill. Joe Biden has clips where he says, I call it the Biden crime bill, where he's basically ragging on Ronald Reagan for being too much of a softie. And so that's the guy that he put up. And like you said, he got rid of the person who was attentive to the needs of the working class and all of this other stuff in order to get Joe Biden over the finish line. It had nothing about being receptive to what the public wanted, if that makes sense. It had everything to do with this kind of third way Democrats where the party itself was like, no. It didn't care. Like, so I feel you on this. This is rings so hollow in the grand scheme of things. It's like, yeah, you guys need to go and vote. For who? For what? What are you guys going to accept? And then when you have both parties that are captured like this, who do you go to when both parties or your agenda is not on the list of either parties? Like, it rings hollow. It rings so hollow. And I suspect that the reason those people are out there protesting is because it does ring hollow. And they realize that what they want in a political space, they can't get it. So we have protests. I agree with you. Yeah, I agree.
Be quiet and to be calm and to be respectful and to, model the system that you want to see. And I'm just afraid, I don't know. I don't see that it's been very effective. If this is the result that we keep seeing, like every week or two, these are only the high profile murders that we hear about, So yeah, he ends his Medium essay with, let's go to work.
Let's go to work? That's how he ends it?
Yeah. So we also have a sad update. The trial of Julian Assange was supposed to have a court hearing today, and he was supposed to be present via video.
Right.
But the report got an email from Belmarsh Prison where Assange is being detained, saying that he's refusing to attend and refusing to sign the refusal form. But his lawyers say that his doctor actually recommended that he not even go into the video conferencing room at the prison for the hearing today because of his health conditions and because of the spread of the coronavirus in prisons across the world. Wow. His lawyer, Edward Fitzgerald, said that Assange has had respiratory problems for some time. So now not only is he walled off from fully participating in his trial even when he is physically present, but he's stuck in detention in conditions that are so dangerous that he can't even access the video link that is linking him to his counsel and to the outside world. Wow. Pretty sad.
Yeah, that's like, the sad part is for the longest time, there were complaints about, like you said, an inability to talk to his defense team privately, for that matter. And now you have this situation where they had him in court in like a little box. This doesn't come across as justice to me. It doesn't come across as fair at all. It almost comes across as the fix is in. And again, this is somebody who wasn't, he went for political asylum. That keeps getting missed. You know what I mean? They missed that as if he was trying to just jump bail in order to go on vacation in the Bahamas or something. No, he was basically trying to get asylum. And now he's in a situation where they seem to be trying to end his life in broad daylight while he's in prison. That's awful. Do they have any, what's going to be the repercussions of that? I mean, he's basically saying, look, not only am I not signing this, I'm not going to participate in this process anymore. This process is greatly unfair. So what's the response to him taking that tenor?
Well, I mean, I think it's because it's on his doctor's order, so I don't know that there's going to be any kind of punitive response. But the result of this virus is simply that, it's sort of lucky for the prosecution and for the forces who want Assange detained and silenced for as long as possible, because everything's really being pushed back, right? Supposed to be able to defense and the prosecution to do psychiatric reports on Assange, but because they can't get access to the prison, all of this stuff has been pushed back to the end of July. But now we do have a bunch of Australian members of parliament and former senators and members of the legislature who signed a letter to the foreign minister of Australia saying that Assange should be released on bail. They finally are sort of waking up to this and saying, look, hearings have been disrupted and delayed. Mr. Assange is unable to have his case heard now until September 2020, while deaths in the UK prison population rise and illness among people who work in the prison and people who work in the judicial system also continue to rise. And so there's really not a lot of justification for you to keep holding him without bail when he is clearly a nonviolent prisoner. So finally, his nation coming sort of to his defense, right? At least some of them.
Australia's just been standing there, because I've been asking this question, what is Australia doing? What is Australia doing? That's its parent country. So it's nice that they're saying something. Like you said, they're coming around, waking up, say, hey, you're going to kill that guy. Maybe you should let him out on bail.
Right. And another case, sort of similar, case of shutting the barn door after the cows have escaped. Democratic Senator Brian Schott from Hawaii, you might have seen this. It's good effort, I guess. He's going to introduce an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act to stop the program that transfers military weaponry to local police departments. Schatz made this announcement on Twitter Sunday saying, it's clear many police departments don't train and supervise for restraint and de-escalation, and some officers are just plain racist and violent.
He's just now realizing that? That just dawned on him. He's like, wow, I didn't know this before, but it seems like some of these guys are violent and they're not de-escalating. No kidding.
Yeah. But so he said, look, we combine this with a president who appears enthusiastic about making it worse and weaponry transferred from the Department of Defense, and here we are. So he's going to try and stop that program. Now, the Obama administration did some restrictions on this program in 2015, but the Trump administration came in 2017 and rolled back those restrictions, make cops great again. Wow. So this is round two of trying to stop giving U.S. cops tanks.
Man, that's horrible. I mean, because it's this has been going on for decades, and it takes something like this for a congressman to be like, hey, it looks like these guys can be really aggressive at times. Maybe they shouldn't have this machinery. Yeah, maybe they shouldn't have that machinery. I mean, you have these little neighborhoods with these huge military vehicles riding through the city. It's insane. And yet, this is our country. And so it's nice, I suppose, that one or two people are popping their heads up saying, hey, maybe this is not necessarily something we should have going forward in our country. People who are at some point racist, at other point just overly aggressive, to have this much machinery and this much equipment with, of course, these little restraints on their ability to dispatch force. So, yeah, that's horrible.
I mean, it's already got the equipment, you know what I mean? I don't think that they'll be taking it back. But then again, if 35 is any example, all of those tanks and Humvees will just break down immediately and be useless 6 months after we got them. So
that's hilarious. Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate it. I want to give a shout out to all of our guests for today: Garland Nixon, Brianna Griffith. Also, thank you to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, Sol, and the entire Sputnik News Network team. Last but not least, a big thank you to our producer, Mrs. Michelle Whitty, and on behalf of the vacationing Bob Schlehuber, that will be back tomorrow, and myself, Jamal Thomas. Thank you guys for listening. Have a good one. Guys, as always, I thank you for joining us for the show. Let's see, let me kill this. Always have a bunch of stuff to close at the end. Yeah, guys, I thank you all for joining us for the show. Like, share, all that good stuff. Trudy, will Ellison aim for justice or status quo? Trudy, actually think Ellison is being serious about this. Now, Chief Ellison said that he's looking to charge the other 3 officers that were involved. I strongly suspect giving it to Ellison indicates seriousness. I could be wrong, but I don't get the feeling that Ellison is trying to dodge this. I get the feeling that he's trying to actually go after the people who are responsible. I don't think you would have given it to Ellis if that was your objective. They would have just left it where it was. Angry Cat, Garland, please stop the censorship of fault lines. No justice, no peace. Okay, I don't know what censorship is going on in fault lines. Kerry Mack, looting $4 trillion is not a crime. So let's kill and torture a man for $20. Yes. Yeah, Kerry Mack, yeah, basically. Basically, we are going to abuse. For example, take any of the stores. Let's say Dollar General or let's say Target. You're basically talking about an expropriation of wealth from the bottom to the top going on for the last 50 years. Just even in the last, several months, you're talking about like $4 trillion that they basically just gave to the owner class, whereas everyone else just gets a pittance. Yeah, that's a ripoff. It was a ripoff in 2008 when they did it, when they let homeowners go bust and they gave all their money to Wall Street. It was a ripoff when they gave all their money to corporations this time around. And when Obama gave that tax cut, that 80% of the tax rate to Bush, or Bush's tax cuts to enshrining those into law, that was a ripoff. All of these things are ripoffs. Cutting the tax rate down to like 90% to 70% to 30-something%. Those things are ripoffs. Those are taking money from the public coffers, things that should be used for us and our services. Yeah, that's a problem. Charles Cavan, start shooting, can't start, is an impeachable statement. That statement is problematic, to put it mildly, Charles. To put it mildly.